How many of you believe or think an engineer can be a better doctor? I'm an engineer, by the way. That's what I expected. So only one hand goes up. Let me explain the spirit of my question. So in 2 months back, in the Google's event for developer conference, which Google calls Innovation in the Open, the Google I event, Dr. Lily Peng actually presented a case study. It was about how machine learning can be used in oncology. So on cancer screening, so there was a very tough case apparently, which 5 out of 6 doctors was missing. It was a very early stage of a cancer, and the patient didn't have any history. But the machine was consistently getting it right. Now, there are quite a few open questions on this. Who trained the machine? The machine could have got bias because if you train it wrong. Then again, how do you create that transparency or the traceability in case of the output? In the machine learning world, there is something called interpretability. The deep learning and the machine learning, the way it is, it's a black box. You train it with certain set of data, you get an output, but what had gone into that cause and effect, how do you conclude an answer, how do you infer an answer, there is nothing related to that. So there is that open question too. And then, if the machine fails, who has got the accountability about it? So these are some of the questions there. And possibly the role of the doctor in the future would be to train the machine to actually engineer it so that it performs well. So the role of the doctor would probably become an engineer. So doctors would become better engineers, and the engineers would become better doctors in a way. That's the world of digital exponential. That's the world we are getting into, where things are ephemeral. The skill set which you acquire has got a very short shelf life. It can become irrelevant very quickly. Similarly, there are a few other characteristics of that particular world. So for example, disproportionateness. So once the physical boundaries are going away, there could be a dominant player who can create disproportionate business. So there could be certain skills, certain professions which could die very easily. At the same time, the opportunities are huge. Just to give an example, Amazon is rewriting the rules of retail, and where it can really end up. So that disproportionateness is the other important feature. The world, with the influence of technology, the digital revolution, actually is a world where things are ephemeral, things are uncertain, at the same time disproportionate, but of course, much more prosperous. Now, that's where the counterpoint and the topic of today is. We definitely need the sustenance from our self. The self-preservation here becomes very important, really. Every time a cycle of success or failure happens, so it could be you are on the success side or on a temporary failure side, but the preserved soul, the better soul, is what is going to carry us through. We have to just draw the sustenance from that. And honestly, I had a dilemma whether the talk I'm going to give with some of the experiences I'm going to talk about worth the TEDx. And then I just thought that it's a very old idea which we just have to re-innervate. Sustenance of the soul and the preservation of the soul, really. So that's the key element of it. But I will talk about my toolkit, the approach which I have taken, some of the experiences which will relate to. Now, there are many ways to preserve your soul, really. It's actually getting back to it and knowing it better. Meditation, yoga are some of the ones which many people practice. Mine is a very simple, intuitive approach that to preserve your soul, to know it better, you have to express it first. it's still a bit nebulous, right? What does self-expression mean? So actually, it is to design some experiments which lets me express better. And through the process, I do actually learn my soul, and I actually preserve it in a way. The divine design which works in this is also that the moment I do something as an experiment with the bounties of life, really, it really comes back to my workplace also. It's always fuels and contributes to my work as well. And that's why I have come to believe that there is nothing called work-life balance. You really don't live two lives in the same life. It's one transcending into the other. Just like the self-preservation and the self-expression are transcending in each other. So I will talk of some of my experiments, which are almost like a proof point on the point, what I was just trying to tell. I had always wanted to learn music. But, I grew up in a full boys residential school where, being boisterous was, the way to go. And in the process, I somewhere picked up that learning music would be a little CC. And I missed big time on it. Only when, 2 years back, at the age of 45, I could buy my violin. I always wanted to learn violin. And I've heard that is the toughest instrument. And as luck would have it, I got a lovely teacher. She's a young lady of 80, Fauzia Marika. And when I asked her that, is 45 too late to start learning violin? Her answer was, actually she's taking lessons on algebra. So a lady of 80, learning algebra all by herself on khanacademy.org, that's called celebration of life. So I started learning violin, and along with it, I started learning few more things, actually. So I started learning to become vulnerable, to get back to the discipline of learning something from the basics. And most important, I started learning to empty the cup. Let me explain the metaphor a bit. In my work life, typically, I have to learn something every other day. And I'm always feeling that, I'm learning something. But it's probably is like a full cup with a fluid, and I'm pouring the same fluid and it is overflowing. I'm really not accruing much. You can think of tea. And in the bottom, there is only dust which is accruing. So similarly, supposedly I'm learning a lot, but it is the dust of ego which is actually accruing at the bottom. And that works as a baggage, really. So getting back to learning violin, actually, I started to read the notations, train my ear, and start learning just like a 5-year-old without the baggage. So that whole emotions of learning something new thing got me into a whole new approach to learning. Actually, I've heard, one of my close friend started working on game theoretic research, but, actually did the breakthrough when he started learning origami and pottery. So I used to theorize that possibly it's the same curvatures and the contours were coming back to game theory in a different way. But here it was happening to me. Actually, I was discerning something all of you would know called affective learning. The learning which gets triggered from the moods and emotion, which is typically fired by the limbic part of the brain. So my experiment with violin changed my approach to learning. So, and of course, contributed to my work life too. My, ever since when I started earning money and I could afford, I had been going to the Himalayas. Either side of, either one side of the monsoon. So either it is a pre-monsoon or a post-monsoon, and sometimes on both sides of the monsoon. Every step on the Himalayas, on the trail, on the trekking trail, actually strengthens my soul. The sight of the sunrise and the sunset, the sound of the meandering river, the smell of rhododendron. Everything works like a magic on me. I long to have the life on the trail, the comfortably uncomfortable nights inside the tent in the night, and of course, freedom from the mobile connectivity. Now, 2 years back, sometime the same time when I started doing the violin, I thought of experimenting on a winter trek. It turned out to be a little bit arduous. I was not so prepared. The chill and the snow and the exposure on the mountains, I was really not prepared for that. I didn't prepare well. And I was accompanied by my friend and guide, Pratham Singh, and it was actually his third trek into that winter season. And Pratham is always very joyous and very happy, and mind you, it's his work, really. So he's so joyous and happy in his work. And one night, after the dinner, we were washing utensils together. That's how you do your tent life. And I asked him, Pratham, what keeps you going like this? His answer was a very simple one. He said, fun in hardship. He was completely truthful and sincere when he said this. I often think of myself as I fancy actually that I'm a Sherpa taking my customers on a digital trek or a technology trek, whatever you call. My approach to that, being my guide to my customer has completely changed after this. And mind you, the other, interesting thing is this is a very infectious work ethic. It has somehow, I don't know how that sincerity of Pratham and the sensitivity of Pratham has flown into the workplace where I work. And every other day, my team, we are really outperforming in each other in finding the fun in hardship. So one of my success mantra today is a serendipity out of my experiment on the Himalayan winter trek. I would talk of another one which is very intimate and personal. So when I was young, like most of you guys with my rough ages, there used to be a lot of people who used to come and talk about their sorrow and grief to me. One of my close friends used to tell that, I have a high compassion quotient, and that's the reason for this confiding. Now, I started, living my mundane life and got rooted into the practical world. I lost that connections which I used to make with people so easily. And then, a few years back, again, in my jest of doing experiments with bounties of life, I tried to work with, removal of hunger and child education. Those are, small attempts, really not worth of speaking, and I'm not talking about them. But what it made a difference to me was my compassion quotient was probably coming back. And a big realization which I am now having is, are the dreams more real than the reality? So because the dreams of whatever altruism is changing me as a person, really. And there are so many things happening on the real world with me, really. I have a passing comment, a car passes, and so many. But how many of them actually has an effect on me? But the dreams actually are having a big impact on me, and I'm changing myself. Now, I would like to contrast again back on that digital exponential world. So, all of us are, to an extent, schizophrenic now. When I talk schizophrenic, I mean, see, when I meet you, I get introduced to you, I am also looking at the Facebook profile of yours and LinkedIn of yours, and I'm trying to augment you with the digital you. So there is some fair schizophrenia. And similarly, there is a lot of companies, the Facebooks of the world, who want you to have a contraption of a Oculus Rift and live in a mixed reality world, a virtual reality or an augmented reality, a mixed reality world. So there is a lot of induced dream as well. And that's one of the most, important lesson. What is your dream and what is an induced dream? the great impact of this is, I am running the innovation lab in TCS in utilities, and I have to be very clear about what is original and what is my dream. Otherwise, I might lose out on the whole. So that's how my ventures or experiments on philanthropy is coming back to me in making me original and a more innovator, really. So many of you are very young, and already some of you are very successful, and very soon you will also be on the world and see a lot of success. Mind you, the self-preservation is a very important thing here, and the prosthetic legs and the bionic arms are good, but the prosthetic soul and bionic spirits, who wants? So I would suggest, go out, experiment, and express yourself. Life is bountiful. Thanks.